Hey, you are now listening to the Graceway Podcast. Let's talk.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to Let's Talk. My name is Jeff Adams here with Pastor Tim Dunn, and we're here to talk. And I guess, Pastor Tim, I represent a good number of people that watch this podcast every week. And so the questions that I ask, hopefully, are some that many of you would be asking. And before we even get started, let me just remind you, this is a podcast, and I don't know how you found us today, but we are available anywhere you get your podcasts, Google, Apple, Spotify, whatever. And let me just urge you, as I always do, if you've not yet done so, please subscribe. And that way we can notify you when a new episode comes out every week, and you won't miss a thing. So, Pastor Tim, good practical teaching this morning. We're in the third month of going through the Bible.
Right.
And we're still in those crazy 5 books of Moses, right? The Pentateuch, the Torah.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting to me because those are the books that usually break everybody's ambition to read through the Bible.
Yeah, sure.
And it's almost like we're going through the wilderness ourselves as we try to read through those books. But your point today was that the wilderness has a purpose, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned there's 3 things that we need to keep our eyes on. But before we even get into that, you shared a statistic today, and I'd not heard the statistic, but obviously you're on top of these things, that because of the pandemic, the church, you're not talking about this church, that church, but the church in America has lost about 30%. Not people who got mad, not people who, they just wrote the church out of their life.
Yeah.
How does that feel as a shepherd, a pastor? What are the things that are going through your mind as you kind of get your head around that statistic?
How does that feel? Wow.
There's obviously some feeling attached.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking through all the edits. No, I think worry is the biggest for me because whether you look at the wilderness here, whether you look at John 10, the enemy has intents, vulnerabilities that get created, I know what happens in people's lives when they get away from faith and God's people, and the pastor in me wants to spare people that. The pastor in me worries when people play in traffic, so to speak. And then I think there's also a bit of wanting to learn, wanting to understand, wanting the church, this church, and the church to get better. Spending time through. Obviously, people are going to come and go. Obviously, people are going to leave. Obviously, people are going to make decisions. But I think when you just put the cards on the table and say, in a time of incredible transition and need and division, 30% of the church found greater commonality outside of the church. I think the church has to be humble enough to say, why?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I truly appreciate the way that you handled it this morning. You didn't come down as being mad or angry or preaching hard, but the word that you used a lot today, I think the focus was in the book of Numbers. You're talking about the wilderness. Yeah. You're talking about following God through those dry seasons of life. But the word that you used several times that I think is a powerful word is this generation of Israel got stuck in the wilderness. Yeah. And your application of that is the church in America got stuck in the pandemic.
Yeah, I think so.
So when you look at what are the implications of that, do you think, as we look at the future? I mean, here's a generation of Israel that lengthened an 11 or 12-day journey into 40 years.
Yeah.
You're not a prophet, I understand that.
I'm not.
What do you see?
I'm not. Yeah, I mean, I one of our big things is, we wanting, especially churches of scale. I think the churches that continue to emphasize program and events and those kind of things are going to continue to struggle or struggle worse. I think churches that emphasize, and this is so simplistic, and we could do 10 podcasts on this, but we're really trying to emphasize relational proximity, emphasize connectivity to one another. I think here what something that I have to own is, we were in a spot of transition. We were emphasizing things like weekend services, and we were emphasizing small groups. We always have,
Right.
but just some of the relational proximity stuff. And to be honest, I was in the spin cycle a bit myself with COVID, for myself, for my family, for the church. And so I think what the church has to do is emphasize people, not programs. And I think we have to listen. I think we have to do a better job listening to where people are, to how they got there, to what people need. I think old-fashioned pastoring is a really, really important thing right now. I've been talking a lot to the pastors just about the vast majority of their time not being spent with their laptop, but being spent with people.
With people, yeah.
Yeah, and then I think things like today, right, of how do we both simplify and accentuate what people experience when they come here in a way that gives them handlebars when the bottom falls out. And I always try to do that. But you would know, I'm just going to teach you through the Bible. And I've said this because I want you to learn to see God in all of Scripture, and I want you to learn to hear from God in Scripture. And for me, not only do I want the church to listen better, not only do I want greater relational proximity and connectivity, but I also want to teach our people how to hear. And I mean, it doesn't get more basic than this, but how to hear from and follow God in the absence of that service.
You've used a phrase several times in your tenure here at Graceway that I truly appreciate, that your goal is not to give people more information about the Bible, but to teach them how to think biblically.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm really hearing you say through that, where you listen to the voice of God, slow down, be quiet, be still, but learn to think biblically. It's not just about going through a program.
Yeah, and I think I believe that even more now. I think how I was listening to Christians process what I was seeing Christians post, things that I was watching Christians connect themselves to, that I don't think Christians had any business associating with, let alone endorsing, and I think that part of the course correct for me was I've got to get very serious about the simple. You spend time hearing from God with God's people, because this is going to happen again. I mean, it maybe not to the extent, maybe not in the next handful of years, but and I'm a big believer in the weekend. I'm not, but I think that we have to faith insulate the church a little bit better than we have, create a little bit more sturdiness of mind and faith in the disciples of Jesus during these times. Because we did not respond well in COVID. We didn't. 30% loss. The church has to own some of that. There's no getting around it.
Yeah, if not all of that. My background, having lived in other countries and struggling for decades, literally, to connect with the American church. And a lot of that goes back to something that I can remember hearing decades ago that was said of a very well-known pastor, one that began, not began, but one of the first mega churches. And it was said of that individual, he could build a church even if God were dead.
Yeah.
And I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
That we build the programs and the activities, and we have all these ways and methods to draw people in.
Yeah.
But people are drawn into a country club. They're drawn into service clubs. They're drawn into a lot of things.
That's right.
And I love what you're saying about the church has to own that.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Well, I think today's message, there's not a much more. You got what I said today on flannel graph, right? Like, God is provider, God is protector, worship God. But yeah, I think I'm trying. The church has to get better at producing storm ready Christians. We have to let go of some of the things, and we have to be more humble and listen more than we did. I mean, I'm afraid that there are churches, and I'm not saying that we're exempt from this or that this isn't true of us, but are having whiplash of thinking that they're kind of at the center of power and policy and those kind of things, and we're very quickly out on the outside of some of those things, and that the church getting used to not being able to be a part of power grabs is both biblical, but anytime the church has tried to associate with movements of power, it snaps back on the church. And for me, COVID had a potentially great refining potential for the church to let's just get back to the basics. Let's do what only we're called to do. Let's prepare our folks to deeply love Jesus, hear from God. I'm at a I want to listen more and strip everything else down space right now, and I don't know. To be honest with you, I don't know. I think anybody who says they know exactly what to do next with the church is trying to sell a book.
Well, yeah, I think so. A book or a methodology or whatever.
Yeah.
As you know, I had a chance to be involved in ministry in a couple of wartime situations, and in one of those countries in particular, in El Salvador, this has been more years ago than most of our listeners can remember.
Sure.
But it was amazing to me to see that in the midst of a bloody civil war, the church grew.
Right.
It didn't shrink by 30%.
Right.
It grew by quantum,
Right.
from 2% to 20% of the population.
Right.
And yet in America here, we have this image of being a Christian country.
Yeah.
And the Christian country church decreased by 30%, not in the middle of a war, but in the middle of a disease.
Yeah, and something that had the potential to be catalytic for us, it had the opposite effect.
And do you think that we can still be purified? Do you think we can come back? Are you optimistic?
About what? Am I optimistic about I don't want to go back to what it was before.
No, but I mean, are you optimistic about something positive coming out of this? You've talked about
Yeah.
today about how the wilderness is to refine, to
Yeah.
deepen, to strengthen,
Yeah, no,
to mold us.
That's what's thrown me off. I have zero concern that God is going to continue to build his church and the gates of COVID are not going to prevail against it.
That's a good quote.
Yeah, or whoever wins the 2024 or what happens in Russia. Now, is there going to be a return to prominence, to power, to numbers, to I don't know. For me, that was never the aim.
Yeah.
And so is God going to purify his church? Is the church going to have the wisdom to slow down, to listen, to engage in points of tension and conflict in biblical ways? Oh, I hope this one is.
Yeah. And that's really all that we can control.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah. So, you and I have talked before. I mean, this is the global church is not centered in the United States, and
The global church is very healthy.
and the global church is doing great and continued to do great during COVID. So whenever I hear people, and not you obviously, but whenever I hear people talk about getting back to whatever normal, the axis of the global church already moved. We are already decentered from the place of influence that we feel like we've had. Now we still have vestiges of it. We still have the preponderance of money, but the culture of the global church isn't being made by Americans anymore.
Exactly. They're not following our patterns.
They're not following our patterns, and if anything, they're learning from our mistakes, which is great.
Yeah.
But for me, what COVID has the potential to do is get us, because some of our programs and our systems and all those got stripped out of us, if we'll listen, and I mean globally, not just locally, I think that we do have the opportunity to join what God is doing in the world at a broader level. Now, what God will have to take out of us is this demand for credit and control. You and I have talked about that at significant length. But my hope is that a 30% loss humbles the American church
Yeah.
and allows us to be a part of what God's doing in the world, which is profound and beautiful and fruitful and God glorifying. In the American church, everybody always talks about the American church is dying and all those kind of things. The numbers don't represent that either. The American church is there are spots that it's growing and there are spots that it's dying. What is dying, gratefully, is some of the aligning with political positions,
Yeah.
some of the glad handing and the money grabs and those kind of things. COVID, drove multiple Mack trucks through that. Now, whether or not we will let go of it finally and ultimately, or try to grab back the pieces of it, I think remains to be seen. But I think that God used COVID to knock some things out of our hands, and I think that it would be wise of the church, before we pick things back up, to think long and hard about. So I'll just say one thing that I pray is, God, whatever you took from us in COVID, I just need you to be clear on what I'm supposed to try to pick back up in terms of vision, in terms of direction, and so anytime I think about restarting something, I normally spend a couple weeks just trying to seek God on, am I supposed to restart this?
Yeah.
Are we supposed to redo this? Are we supposed to? And, like the Love Justice thing came out of a season where we were sort of involved with Love Justice, but it was a pick that back up.
Yeah, and for people that don't know what Love Justice is, this is a ministry that fights human trafficking.
Yeah.
And that was co-founded by a couple that have roots here in Gracewell, although they no longer live in the Kansas City area.
Right.
So explain what happened with Love Justice just a little bit, so that people who are podcast watchers can hear that.
We had just been talking for a couple years, even pre-COVID, about partnership at a significant level. And to be very honest with you, I had a grid in my head around partnership that I still believe. I around sustainability and around participatory. I'm not a big fan of missions tourism and those kind of things. I'm not a big fan of American churches doing short-term missions that take jobs and ministry out of nationals' hands.
Right.
I'm a big fan of God. God allows us to use what we've learned and what we had to benefit and bless others. And I think it's time for the American church to, we don't have to be on the big billboard. Like we can fade into the shadows a little bit unless God says otherwise. But with the Love Justice thing, we had been talking, and as great as they are, and as great as what they're doing is, I had never had, I feel silly saying this, but I had never had this high compulsion to join what they're doing. I don't know why. But this last time that we met, it was like the volume was up. Like you need to be a part of, you need to lead Graceway to be a part of that, which led to what we did a couple weeks ago. And so I think when I think about where we're sending people, different partnerships, how I'm teaching, what I'm teaching, different ways that we're trying to make disciples here, I'm doing a lot more listening, honestly, probably than I ever have.
I was just going to go back to that, because that's been a theme, not only of what you spoke on this morning, but it's been a theme of what we've been talking about, that ability to listen to God when you're going through those dry seasons.
And others.
And others, exactly. God and others.
Yeah.
And it sounds to me like that's exactly what's happening in your case. And it's not that you don't care about human trafficking beforehand.
No.
That's not the issue. But it's, okay, God, is this what you have for us right now in this season?
Yeah, especially at the level that we're intending to do it. I mean, I had made the statement from the stage, and I think on this podcast, two things that I think a church has to be involved in: Bible translation and human trafficking. You've heard me say that sans human trafficking.
Yes.
And so that's a significant escalation. But yeah, I think for me, just pastorally, I'm having to slow down. I'm having to listen more. Our systems were ruined in COVID, which you can grieve all you want, but there's a lot of potential for a lot of new wineskins to be created coming out of COVID.
Yeah.
And so and so I'm trying to listen as broadly as I can, as deeply as I can, as slowly as I can, and I frankly, I have no idea what's going to come out of it.
Yeah.
But again, even this series was a product of COVID. You know, if you had said 2 years ago, you should teach through the entire Bible in a year, like, no, thank you.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
You know, it's interesting. I spent some time in Eastern Europe before the fall of communism and experienced personally the pressure, the darkness, and then we went through a time when there was a great deal of confusion and suffering, and even some war that took place in that part of the world that gave birth to a revitalized church.
Yeah.
And we can see the benefits in countries like Romania that is now receiving so many of the people coming out of Ukraine.
That's right.
And so we can only hope and pray that we'll see something similar happen in this country.
Yeah, I think so. And, you know, at the macro level, we'll see. But here, where I'm gonna stand before God for, I mean, we're deeply committed to white knuckling what we're certain of, and that's a very small list right now, very small, smaller than pre-COVID.
Yeah.
And being very open-handed with form and function and programs and systems and all of those kind of things, and I think just putting a little bit more skin on things maybe than I would have before.
Sure.
So yeah.
Well, you know, you talked about the three things that we need to look toward in those moments in the dry season. God is our provider. God is our protector. And the final point I thought was so important, and that is worshiping God even when it makes no sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what I'm hearing you say through that is whatever comes of this, it won't be because we figure it out.
No. Yeah, it's because we follow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And worship when it makes no sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, I'm fascinated to see. I really am. But we'll see. I don't know.
I love the way this morning you brought it back, and here we are, kind of stuck in the mud of the Old Testament, so to speak.
Sure.
Those passages where it's so easy to get stuck, but you kind of put a four-wheel drive onto us this morning as we looked at that, and you talked about how in the midst of that Moses is on his way out, and Joshua comes on, who is a picture for us of Jesus in so many ways. And then what you did, you took us back to the temptation of Jesus,
right,
where he is tempted by the very devil in those same three issues.
Right.
Are you going to trust God to provide? Are you going to trust God to protect? Are you going to worship God or someone else?
Yeah.
Does somebody else fill that God spot? No.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, as we've talked many times, and as you know, I was reading everything I get my hands on wilderness and blah, 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 and really started to see those themes in that whole 40-year space of they're always grumbling about we're not safe and we don't have what we need again and again and again, and then it always ended up affecting their worship, and I just thought, oh, that's interesting, and I had that part done in my notes, and God just kind of kept, hey, look over here. And so I just started following wilderness through, and then got studying Matthew 4 and thought, oh my goodness.
And that takes us all the way back to the garden.
That's right.
And you've been following that theme from the temple and the garden and all the way through Moses to the book of Revelation. But that's where Adam and Eve got off track in these same three areas, same three temptations.
Yeah. No, that's the incredible thing about the Bible is, you'll find a thread and you just keep pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling and over to 1 John and
exactly.
you just it's the best.
Yeah, it's just kind of hard to improve upon the Bible. But I think sometimes we get so locked into our intellectual desire to have all of the answers and control it all that I think sometimes God uses those wilderness times to, you said it several times in this podcast, to bring us to a point of humility.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, this one probably more than maybe any of them. I mean, I probably said 20% of what my notes were. today, but this one's been really, really good for me because just personally, because COVID, as I've said, was a very both emotional and dry season, and I think that I'm still kind of clawing out of that hole, and I think for me, just seeing these three all the way through, when I do my own COVID autopsy, I see the ways I got off on all three.
Yeah.
And I think it also really, for me, humanizes the Hebrews in the wilderness. I think that we kind of condescend to their experience.
Yeah, we tend to think, oh, those silly Hebrews, if they would have just done this.
Yeah.
And then you realize, no, they're just a representative of all of us.
Yeah, and
Wow.
even the Moses piece. You think of God saying, "You didn't listen to me, you don't get to go in." I mean, that feels really brutally harsh.
But it feels brutally honest.
Brutally
and
honest.
real.
And when I tie in the Jesus again, like as I'm gonna say it exactly as the Father said it, I hope the sermons are going well. I'm loving the process, just personally, of pieces fitting together and just enjoying.
Well, as one guy on the pew, I'm loving it too. It's been great.
Sure.
And I think both of us over our life have had our times to be hitting the rock with the staff.
Yeah.
Wanting the water to come out. So yeah, it brings us all back to that point of humility.
It does.
And that brings us back to the point of saying goodbye until next time. I think it's about time to wrap it up.
Yeah.
But before we go, just a reminder, subscribe to this podcast if you would, wherever you get your podcast. And while you're at it, if you could leave us a nice review, that would help as well. Invite your friends and family and people that you think would benefit from just an honest discussion between two people that love God and love the Bible and are trying to figure out our own humanity. So if you would, we will wait and we will see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into the Graceway Experience. Hope we can talk again sometime.